Hi, my name's Scott MacArthur, and today I'm going to be talking about public engagement in science. We're going to be looking at why facts don't appear to change people, how research can engage the public, and finally I'm going to consider some of the professional development skills and professional approaches that you can take to improve the levels of engagement in your work as a scientist. So the first thing we're going to consider is this question of why facts don't change people. And to help us get into that and to set the feeling for the whole event, I'm going to ask you to do a little quiz with me. I'm going to give you 10 seconds. I'd like you to look at this picture. And in this picture, you'll see there's numbers 1 to 45. I'm going to give you 10 seconds and I'd like you to count as many as you can consecutively in that time. Your time starts now. Time's up. Where did you get to? Let me know in the comments or send me a note where do you think you got to. I'll be interested to know. But let's do it again. But to help you with it, I'm going to do this. Are you ready? Go. Where did you get to that time? I know that you got further than you got the first time. And what I've just done, it's a bit of fun to get us engaged, but it also demonstrates something called framing. And the purpose of today is to look at this challenging topic, and what I'm going to try and do is give you some frames that can really help you understand why it's so difficult to communicate and get public engagement in science, but also to try and explain the reasons for that and give you some strategies or ways of reframing how you work and communicate with the public that can really change how your science and your research lands and how people may behave and may change their behaviour as a consequence. There's something very odd happens with a lot of science when it's communicated to the public in general. A scientist or a group of scientists more commonly will communicate something that says A. The public will then interpret that as meaning B. Somehow there's a loss in translation between the message that the scientist is trying to communicate to the public and what the public actually perceive. Now, what I'm not going to do today is I'm not going to be delving into the wonderful world of rhetoric and I'm not going to be looking at the rhetorical scholars. What I am going to do though is I'm going to talk about why your messages get lost in translation, why they lack resonance with the public, and why that is not necessarily what you should be expecting from your messaging. What I am going to do though is go to my friend here and look at my model of the brain. Now, we all know that this is an incredibly complex thing, and the most recent research suggests there are almost 90 billion cells within the human brain, and each one of those cells is as complex as a city. Each one of those cells is as complex as a city. It always makes me giggle when people say they understand the human brain. I'm not sure anyone really does. And in my work when I was a scientist, I did some work with the human brain, mainly around Alzheimer's, and I've done 50 partial autopsies and full brain dissections, and it's very difficult to work with. And up until recently it was regarded as something of a mystery box, a black box. But in the last few years we've started to uncover some of the secrets of those 90 billion brain cells and how they work together to create what is human cognition. Now, I first presented on this topic after having experienced difficulty communicating as a scientist, trying to get our messages across to the public at large. I did a TEDx talk in Warwick in 2015. It was quite a daunting experience, and there was 3,000 people there, and I was on that famous red dot, and I spoke about why facts don't change people. The first thing I did on the TEDx stage was to ask the audience a question. It's now a famous story, and it's a story that I've told many times myself, but I'll repeat it because I think it puts across the key challenges that we have in this space today. I'd like you to join me in a little thought experiment. Imagine you're at work and it's a Thursday. You're feeling a bit hot under the collar, you're feeling a bit low, you're a bit sweaty, and you think, better make an appointment to go and see the doctor. So you call the doctor's surgery and she can see you the next morning. So you pop along the next morning, you go in to see your doctor, and she says, okay, you don't look great, let's do some tests and see if we can find out what's wrong. So she does your blood pressure, she takes some bloods, etc. She then sends you off and you go back to work and you're feeling a bit off, but you just go back about your normal business as you would normally. Then on Monday morning, after a quiet weekend, because you've not been feeling great, the phone rings. It's the receptionist at your doctor's surgery, and the chap says the doctor would like to see you and she'd like to see you now if possible. Ask yourself how you would feel at that moment. How would you feel? You've just been asked to come in to see your doctor, having been to see her on the Friday about something that you feel is wrong with you. I know how I would feel, and I would feel worried. So in you go to see the doctor. Now, in true doctor style, she doesn't really have great interpersonal skills, and she says, right, no easy way of telling you this, you've got a problem with your heart. The type of problem you have fundamentally is fatal, so I'm really sorry, but you have got a serious heart condition that is very likely to kill you. Now ask yourself how you're feeling. I know how I'd be feeling, and it really wouldn't be good at this point. But then she gives you some hope. She says, however, there is one thing you can do that can really help mitigate the problem that you've got with your heart. And that is to move to a vegan diet. Not just an ordinary vegan diet though. It would be what they call a radical vegan diet, which is basically a green leaf diet. Now, even the vegans out there watching this, I'm sure, would be challenged by just eating green leaves for the rest of their lives. But you're sitting and you think, whew, it's a bit like a get out of jail card. If I just change my diet, I'll be okay. And the doctor says, well, the results from our studies are that if you do go into this new diet, you've got a very good chance, more than 90% chance of living a full life. So off you go. Now I want you to come out of that thought experiment and think about yourself. What would you do? Would you engage in that diet? Would you? Really? Well, most people, when I ask them, and when I asked that at the TEDx event, probably 90% of the hands went up in the room when I asked them to put their hands up. I paused and I said, well, the reality is only 9% of you would stick to that diet. So rather than change to save your life, you would choose, even though it's a catastrophic situation with your health, you would choose to die rather than go into a strict green leaf vegan diet. Now, there's a funny side to that. I don't know if I could go into a vegan diet. It would be quite scary. But I think if it was a choice between life or death, whether I lived or I died, I would hope that I would change to that diet. But the research that sat behind that story, and it is not trivial, the research that sat behind that suggested that of the 10,000 people that were engaged in the actual scientific research from which I took that story, most of them, the vast majority of them, would choose death over changing their diet. There's something odd going on here. Facts don't seem to change our behaviour and our practices. So what on earth is going on here? How do we get to understand or form an understanding of why people aren't influenced by facts the way we would think rationally that they would be? Well, the good news is that the cognitive scientists are on the game. One of those scientists, a fellow called Jonathan Haidt, is particularly interesting, and he's come up with an idea that I think is fascinating and well worth consideration. In his book, The Happiness Project, Jonathan describes the mind as an elephant with a writer sat on its back. What does that mean? It's quite an interesting metaphor, because what Jonathan suggests is that the elephant is the part of the brain that is free form. It goes where it wants, it looks for what it wants to look for. It's our habits, it's our normal perceptions, it's our intuitions. The elephant is powered by what you may have heard of called heuristics. These are rules of thumb that help us make decisions without them being conscious. So we will know how to open a door, we will know how to duck if something comes towards us, etc. And the elephant responds very well to that. Haidt refers to this as System 1 thinking. And this is taken from an area called dual process theory, which is very famous but quite complex, and I think Haidt does a good job of making it a lot more understandable. So just to refrain, System 1 thinking, the elephant, is where you have your instincts, your habits, your biases, prejudices, and it is maintained by something called your heuristics. Haidt then goes on to describe a rider, and that rider is sitting on the back of the elephant. And this represents Systems 2 thinking from dual process theory, or also known as metacognition, or thinking about thinking. So it's thinking about your thoughts, and even the words that are in your head as you're thinking come from System 2 thinking. Now this rider is primarily used like an advisor to the elephant. It can't control the elephant particularly well, but it can come into play when you experience something you've never experienced before and therefore don't have a rule of thumb, i.e. a heuristic, in your mind already to help you deal with that. Now this is really interesting, particularly when you encounter things like conflict, i.e. someone tells you that you're wrong about something. So in jumps your reasoning and your objectivity to try and solve the problem. The writer becomes a coach to the elephant. However, I said earlier that the writer can't control the elephant. So how do we deal with this? How I would frame it is for you to think about the writer like a lawyer. Lawyers don't deal with facts. They deal with a case, a hypothesis, and they build a case around that hypothesis to suggest that it's true. So your biases, your opinions, your rational thinking is based on the fact that you have an opinion based on your biases. So what is the point of having a rational part in your brain, this writer that sits on top of the elephant, if it's not there to protect you from bias? This is the paradox that many people have been challenged by this work. Wouldn't you have thought that through the evolutionary processes that the whole idea of cognitive bias would have been removed by evolution? What researchers think is happening at this point is the part I find so interesting. Our writer is not there to look for facts. Our writer is there to look for ways of describing an experience that maintains relationships within the human animal and the other humans that it surrounds itself with. So you are not rationalising to find truth. You are rationalising to continue to be recognised by the group that surrounds you. We've recently seen terrific examples of this, although quite sad, around COVID and around Brexit, where reports have been made by scientists or political scientists, and both parties in this, what I call false duality, have said that the report was accurate. They've said, yes, we agree with the report. They're cherry picking what they want to take from those reports. They're cherry picking to what makes their lawyer think that their case is the best. Indeed, and you may be familiar with this from the literature, when lots of people are in a group and when lots of people have a particular confirmation going on in their heads, this is known as groupthink. And herein lies the great challenge for all of us as communicators. How do you avoid groupthink, or how do you have an impact on other people's groupthink, other people's relationships with their team or with their tribe? How do you get them to think differently? Right. In their book, The Enigma of Reason, Mercia and Sperber say this: reasoning was not designed to pursue the truth. Reasoning was designed by evolution to help us win arguments. So the first question I would like you to think about is, Have you thought about how you think? Have you thought about how you reason the value of your research and how you will then take it to the public and in an attempt to get public engagement? Difficult question. I'd now like to tell you another story that I think really demonstrates why it's so hard for facts to change people. Imagine, and this is quite relevant in today's environment, imagine it's 1968, and I'm sure some of you can remember it, and you're sat in class. It's a mixed class, it's boys and girls, and teacher walks in. She's called Miss Elliott. Miss Elliott comes in and she's got a book in her hand. She walks up and she says, "Children, there's been some research done on eye colour, and it seems to suggest that the colour of your eyes has an impact on your life. So," and she looks round the room and she says, "So, you guys with blue eyes," and she looks at the individuals in the room and points to them, "you guys are very likely to have a poor diet, you're going to have low IQ. Do you remember what IQ was from our tests? You're going to have poor relationships, you're probably not going to be particularly fit or healthy. But the good news is, brown eyes," and she looks around the room again and she points at them, she says, "you folks are going to be the opposite. You're very likely, according to this research, to have good high IQs, you're going to be healthy, you're going to have great relationships, good jobs, and live to a ripe old age." What do you think happened in that classroom? Within moments, the two groups started to take on the labels that Mrs. Elliott had given them. The brown eyes became positive, became stronger than the blue eyes. The blue eyes became subservient, and they were observed over a period of some months, and the grades of the brown eyes were much higher than the grades of the blue eyes, and they did seem to fulfill that label. However, Miss Elliott wasn't finished yet. She came back 6 months later and said, "Right, children, there's been some more research." Edinburgh University this time. That's my additional bit to the story. And she said, it's actually the opposite. The brown eyes are the ones that are going to have low IQs, overweight, poor relationships, and the blue eyes are the ones that are going to have high IQ and live the long, healthy life and have fulfilling careers. In no time at all, they switched again. The behaviours switched, and the blue eyes became dominant and the brown eyes became subservient. Now, you might be thinking to yourself just now, well, I wouldn't give in to that. I just wouldn't react to that. I would have my own opinions. I would make sure I was maybe different to everybody else. I'm sure you would think like that. However, again, I didn't make that story up. That story is from a very famous psychologist. It was done by a lady called Jane "the Bitch" Elliott, she's still alive. She's in her 90s now. I'm recording this in 2020. And she's famous for her work in race and in discrimination. And what she does is she demonstrates the power, the devastating power of labelling. In 1968, of course, those of you who are historians will remember that there were riots all over America, there were race riots, Martin Luther King was shot, and Martin Luther King had been working with the black community saying, "Do not listen to the labels that you're given by the white man." And it was a terrible, terrible time. And what Martin Luther King and Elliott and others suggested was that by labelling those with brown eyes, i.e. people of African descent and Asian descent, they all happen to have brown eyes, as violent, aggressive, as rapists, as looters, etc., they would take on those labels. Jane has now taken that work all over the world, and she's quite, if you look at her on YouTube, I've got a video here, I've a link here I can point you towards. She's a tough cookie, but even with contemporary people, she's done this all over the world. She's done it in the UK quite recently actually. These labels are still powerful enough that the groups separate. And she asks the question, how would someone who had has never lived with that label know what it's like to have the other label? A very powerful question, and that has an impact on how your science lands with the public when you're trying to engage them in what you're trying to teach, learn or advise. It's a very powerful frame, and one must think about what that means in terms of how you communicate. Are you pigeonholing people? Are you pigeonholing communities? It's a challenging piece. You may actually have a frame on yourself. So if you're a physicist and you're used to this standing on the public are used to people standing on mountains pointing at stars, what frame does that create in their head? How are they going to relate to what you're communicating if that's the frame that they have? That's the label they have either for you or you have put on them. Remember the lesson from evolutionary biology though that I said earlier. Confirmation bias is not a flaw. It's a feature of the human brain. One of my favourite books in this area and one of my favourite writers in this area is a guy called Michael McCarthy. Now he's a journalist and a deep thinker, and he's done a lot of interesting work around evolutionary psychology. In his book, The Moth Snowstorm, he frames evolutionary psychology like this. He says we were 50,000 generations as wildlife. 50,000 generations as wildlife. We have only been 500 generations as what we arrogantly call contemporary humans. Our brains and our bodies have just not changed that much in those 500 generations. So we are hardwired to be controlled by the elephant. We're looking for danger. You don't have time to rationalise threats. Our threats are different now. The monsters are not saber-toothed tigers. Sorry if that's a bit trite, but they're not. The monsters could be social media. The monsters could be the media. The monsters could be scientists. So where can we look for advice in this space? When I used to work in laboratories, I remember my professor had a story that was really powerful, and it came into my life when he was actually moving departments. He was professor of pathology and he was moving to running the Surgeons' Hall in Edinburgh. And he asked me, I was his research assistant, and he asked me if I would help him pack up his office, so I did. Now his name was Professor Dougal Gardner, and he featured largely in my life and still does feature in my life significantly, although he passed some 18 months ago. Dougal and I were sitting in his office, and he had written something like 50 books and hundreds of papers that were published in peer-reviewed journals. Two of his most famous books were sat on his desk. And we were chatting about them, what did you think about that book, Scott? He asked me, and I was saying, well, I wasn't sure I understood it, or we were just having a tutor-student type relationship conversation at the time. And he looked at me and he said, do you know what? He said, this book, my big book, and it was one of these it was a big book on histology actually, and it was a big chunky thing. And he said, I'm not sure how well I understood my subject when I wrote that book. I was only a young man and I don't think I was particularly experienced. Then he turned to the other book and he picked it up. It was a little thin book, and he said, but when this book got published, I really understood what I was talking about. Now this is a heuristic, this is a rule of thumb, and I'm not saying it's a general principle, but what I've found since is that people who work in complex areas that really understand those areas can write short books about their subject. So people that come to mind are like, this is one of the most famous science books. It was voted last year as the best ever book about the communication of science. A book by Primo Levi called The Periodic Table. It's great. Another name that comes to mind is Carlo Rovelli. I wonder if you have to be Italian to be good at communicating science, but these are short books. These are books that take complex issues like complex physics or complex chemistry, complex genetics, and summarise them in nice, easy to read books. Is that something you could do with your work? Do you think you could summarise it so someone under the age of 20 could understand your work? Now, I'm the father of 4 children, and another area here that is emergent and it's happening more and more, and there are more and more books like this coming out where authors are writing about complex scientific ideas, but as children's picture books. So they're taking it even further. I mean, this particular one here, it's called I Wonder. It's by Anneka Harris, who's the partner of the neuroscientist and lifelong meditator Sam Harris, who you may know. Now, what Anneka's done in this book is she's looked at some really complex neuroscience and she's summarised it as a children's story. She really understands the subject, and I think that is a good indicator that someone understands what they're talking about. But do you know what? The public get that as well. The public can latch on to these short, clear, image-heavy books and pieces of work and really understand them. Now, I've worked across the world with many of the world's leading organisations, and probably the most common question I've been involved in is, how do we get people to engage in our new business? How do we get people to engage in our new idea for this organisation? Not dissimilar to being a scientist, where you want to get someone engaged in your idea or your research findings. So one of the things I learned quite quickly, and I've worked in over 200 companies now, one of the things I found out quite quickly was there are different ways of framing communication, like the way I started this talk, that can land things better, can really up the chances of what you're doing landing. Now, there's a whole discipline here called sense making, and I've worked with artists and musicians and storytellers to try and build a picture of what an organisation is trying to achieve that can land within a company. One of the methods that I really enjoy is called rich picture development. And this is where you create archetypes of how you would like a business to be. Quite often in consulting speak, they'll look at it as a before and after type picture like this one. But they might also just look at individual behaviours. And I use this when I'm speaking on the keynote stage to get across major points that I want my audience to understand. So for example, in this picture, I'm trying to get the audience to think about the pressure that's put upon them as human beings as a consequence of being surrounded by technology. In this picture, the chronophage, what I'm trying to do, as hopefully you can see, is get across just how important your time is, and how if you're not careful, that all these things here in the picture like Facebook and Twitter and TikTok can gobble up your time, and that can mean you're not spending your time as best you might. So these pictures go across cultures. So whether I've been working in China, United States, Italy, France, etc., it doesn't really matter. Images really cut through major noise in how you're trying to communicate to your audience. So think about the images that you use when you're trying to communicate with the public. Think about them in terms of how you use them even within your own department. And I'll come back to that in the next part of the talk.